Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Chapter 6. The Shoemaker. "Good day," said Monsieur Defarge, looking down at the white head that bent low over the shoemaking. It was raised for a moment, and a very faint voice responded to the salutation, as if it were at a distance. "Good day." "You are still hard at work, I see." After a long silence, the head was lifted up for another moment, and the voice replied, "Yes, I am working." This time, a pair of haggard eyes that looked at the question before the face had dropped again. The faintness of the voice was pitiable and dreadful. It was not the faintness of physical weakness, though confinement and hard fate no doubt had their part in it. Its deplorable peculiarity was that it was the faintness of solitude and disuse. It was like the last feeble echo of a sound made long and long ago. So entirely had it lost the life and resonance of the human voice, that it affected the senses like a once beautiful color, faded away into a poor weak stain. So sunken and suppressed it was, that it was like a voice underground. So expressive it was of a hopeless and lost creature, that a famished traveler, wearied out by lonely wandering in the wilderness, would have remembered home and friends in such a tone before lying down to die. Some minutes of silent work had passed, and the haggard eyes had looked up again, not with any interest or curiosity, but with a dull, mechanical perception beforehand that the spot where the only visitor they were aware of had stood was not yet empty. "I want," said Defarge, who had not removed his gaze from the shoemaker, "to let in a little more light here. You can bear a little more?" The shoemaker stopped his work, looked with a vacant air of listening at the floor on one side of him, then similarly at the floor on the other side of him, then upward at the speaker. "What did you say?" "You can bear a little more light." "I must bear it if you let it in," laying the palest shadow of stress upon the second word. The opened half-door was opened a little further and secured at that angle for the time. A broad ray of light fell into the garret, and showed the workman, with an unfinished shoe upon his lap, pausing in his labor. His few common tools and various scraps of leather were at his feet and on the bench. He had a white beard, raggedly cut, but not very long, a hollow face, and exceedingly bright eyes. The hollowness and thinness of his face would have caused him to look large under his yet dark eyebrows and confused white hair, though they had been really otherwise but. They were naturally large, and looked unnaturally so. His yellow rags of shirt lay open at the throat, and showed his body to be withered and worn. He in his old canvas frock, and his loose stockings, and all his poor tatters of clothing, had in a long seclusion from direct light and air faded down to such a dull uniformity of parchment yellow that it would have been hard to say which was which. He had put up a hand between his eyes and the light, and the very bones of it seemed transparent. So he sat with a steadfastly vacant gaze, pausing in his work. He never looked at the figure before him without first looking down on this side of himself, then on that, as if he had lost the habit of associating place with sound. He never spoke without first wandering in this manner and forgetting to speak. "Are you going to finish that pair of shoes today?" asked Defarge, motioning to Mr. Lorry to come forward. "What did you say?" "Do you mean to finish that pair of shoes today?" "I can't say that I mean to. I suppose so. I don't know." But the question reminded him of his work, and he bent over it again. Mr. Lorry came silently forward, leaving the daughter by the door. When he had stood for a minute or two by the side of Defarge, the shoemaker looked up. He showed no surprise at seeing another figure, but the unsteady fingers of one of his hands strayed to his lips as he looked at it. His lips and his nails were of the same pale lead color, and then the hand dropped to his work, and he once more bent over the shoe. The look and the action had occupied but an instant. "You have a visitor, you see," said Monsieur Defarge. "What did you say?" is a visitor." The shoemaker looked up as before, but without removing a hand from his work. "Come," said Defarge. "Here is a monsieur who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one. Show him that shoe you are working on. Take it, monsieur." Mr. Lorry took it in his hand. "Tell monsieur what kind of shoe it is, and the maker's name." There was a longer pause than usual before the shoemaker replied, "I forget what it was you asked me. What did you say?" "I said, couldn't you describe the kind of shoe for monsieur's information?" "It is a lady's shoe. It is a young lady's walking shoe. It is in the present mode. I never saw the mode. I have had a pattern in my hand." He glanced at the shoe with some little passing touch of pride. "And the maker's name?" said Defarge. Now that he had no work to hold, he laid the knuckles of the right hand in the hollow of the left, and then the knuckles of the left hand in the hollow of the right, and then passed a hand across his bearded chin, and so on in regular charges without a moment's intermission. The task of recalling him from the vacancy into which he always sank when he had spoken was like recalling some very weak person from a swoon, or endeavoring, in the hope of some disclosure, to stay the spirit of a fast-dying man. "Did you ask for my name?" "Assuredly I did." 105, North Tower." "Is that all?" 105, North Tower." With a weary sound that was not a sigh nor a groan, he bent to work again until the silence was again broken. "You are not a shoemaker by trade?" said Mr. Lorry, looking steadfastly at him. His haggard eyes turned to Defarge, as if he would have transferred the question to him, but as no help came from that quarter, they turned back to the questioner when they had sought the ground. "I am not a shoemaker by trade. No, I was not a shoemaker by trade. I learnt it here. I taught myself. I asked leave to—" He lapsed away, even for minutes, ringing those measured changes on his hands the whole time. His eyes came slowly back at last to the face from which they had wandered. When they rested on it, he started and resumed, in the manner of a sleeper that moment awake, reverting to a subject of last night. "I asked leave to teach myself, and I got it with much difficulty after a long while, and I have made shoes ever since." As he held out his hand for the shoe that had been taken away from him, Mr. Lorry said, still looking steadfastly in his face, "Monsieur Manette, do you remember nothing of me?" The shoe dropped to the ground, and he sat looking fixedly at the questioner. "Monsieur Manette," Mr. Lorry laid his hand upon Defarge's arm, "do you remember nothing of this man? Look at him. Look at me. Is there no old banker, no old business, no old servant, no old time rising in your mind, Monsieur Manette?" As the captive of many years sat looking fixedly by turns at Mr. Lorry and at Defarge, some long obliterated marks of an actively intent intelligence in the middle of the forehead gradually forced themselves through the black mist that had fallen on him. They were overclouded again. They were fainter. They were gone, but they had been there, and so exactly was the expression repeated on the fair young face of her who had crept along the wall to a point where she could see him, and where she now stood looking at him, with hands which at first had been only raised in frightened comparison, if not even to keep him off and shut out the sight of him, but which were now extending toward him, trembling with eagerness to lay the spectral face upon her warm young breast, and love it back to life and hope. So exactly was the expression repeated, though in stronger characters, in her fair young face, that it looked as though it had passed, like a moving light, from him to her. Darkness had fallen on him. In its place, he looked at the two less and less attentively, and his eyes in gloomy abstraction sought the ground, and looked about him in the old way, Finally, with a deep, long sigh, he took the shoe up and resumed his work. "Have you recognized him, monsieur?" asked Defarge in a whisper. "Yes. For a moment, at first, I thought it quite hopeless, but I have unquestionably seen for a single moment a face that I once knew well. Hush! Let us draw further back. Hush!" She had moved from the wall of the garret very near the bench on which he sat. There was nothing awful in his unconsciousness. A figure that could have put out its hand and touched him as he stooped over his labor. Not a word was spoken, not a sound was made. She stood like a spirit beside him, and he bent over his work. It happened at length that he had occasion to change the instrument in his hand for his shoemaker's knife. It lay on that side of him which was not the side on which he stood. He had taken it up and was stooping to work again, when his eyes caught the skirt of her dress. He raised them and saw her face. The two spectators stared forward, but she stayed them with a motion of her hand. She had no fear of his striking at her with the knife, though they had. He stared at her with a fearful look, and after a while his lips began to form some words, though no sound proceeded from them. By degrees, in the passes of his quick and labored breathing, he was heard to say, "What is this?" With the tears streaming down her face, she put her two hands to her lips and kissed them to him, then clasped them to her on her breast, as if she laid his ruined head there. "You are not the gaoler's daughter?" she sighed. "No. Who are you?" Not yet trusting the tones of her voice, she sat down on the bench beside him. He recoiled, but she laid her hand upon his arm. A strange thrill struck him when she did so, and visibly passed over his frame. He laid the knife down softly as he sat staring at her. Her golden hair, which she wore in long curls, had been hurriedly pushed aside and fell down over her neck. Advancing his hand by little and little, he took it up and looked at it. In the midst of the action he went away, and with another deep sigh fell to work in his shoemaking. But not for long. Releasing his arm, she laid her hand upon his shoulder, after looking doubtfully at it 2 or 3 times, as if to be sure that it was really there. He laid down his work, put his hand to his neck, and took off a blackened string with a scrap of folded rag attached to it. He opened this carefully on his knee, and it contained a very little quantity of hair, not more than 1 or 2 long golden hairs, which he had, in some old day, wound off upon his finger. He took her hair into his hand again, and looked closely at it. "It is the same! How can it be? When was it? How was it?" As the concentrated expression returned to his forehead, he seemed to become conscious that it was in hers too. He turned her full to the light and looked at her. "She had laid her head upon my shoulder that night when I was summoned out. She had a fear of my going, though I had none, and when I was brought to the North Tower, they found these upon my sleeve. You will leave me them. They can never help me to escape in the body, though they may in the spirit. Those were the words I said. I remember them very well."